Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this morning. So this is our media availability related to oil and gas methane emissions and recent regulations related to that. So I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I'm David Lyon. I'm a scientist at Environmental Defense Fund in our Austin, Texas office. I'm a researcher who focuses on quantifying oil and gas methane emissions from the supply chain in the United States, but also work on evaluating some technologies and policies for mitigating emissions.
I'm Amy Townsend-Small. I'm a professor at University of Cincinnati in Ohio, and some of my current work is on distinguishing between agricultural, urban, and oil and gas sources of methane, measuring methane emissions from inactive and abandoned wells, and then sort of tangentially related, but measurements of methane emissions from freshwater and permafrost systems, which are likely to be enhanced in a warmer and wetter world.
Hello, I'm Arvind Ravikumar. I am a professor at Harrisburg University in Pennsylvania. I study methane emissions and regulations in the US and Canada, and how new technologies and innovations can help regulators to reduce the cost of methane regulations.
Dan Zimmerle, I'm a research scientist at Colorado State University. We have several programs going right now. One of those is to characterize emissions from compressor stations in the gathering system. It's just about wrapping up. We're starting a new project right now to look at underground gas migration in conjunction with PHMSA and a bunch of large distribution utilities. And we run the VTech, the Methane Emissions Technology Evaluation Center at Colorado State University, which is 7 acres of fake oil well equipment. I like to call them Hollywood well pads because they look like well pads and they emit like well pads, but they're completely no wells beneath them.
My name is Aileen Nowlan, an attorney in the Washington, D.C. office of Environmental Defense Fund. I work on regulatory innovation that enables state and federal regulators to recognize and encourage the current round of innovation on methane mitigation methodologies and encourage the future innovation. I also work with oil and gas companies all around the world to stimulate technology and to support regulations.
Okay, great. So this is just an opportunity for you guys to ask questions of our panelists. So do we have any questions from reporters in the room? Anyone? Do we have any on the chat? No? Oh, go ahead.
I'm Mark Fischetti from Scientific American. Just listening to your introductions, I think this is maybe applicable across the whole. You all specialize in a certain thing, which is great. Is there a place or a group, or maybe are you connected with people who are looking at fugitive emissions across the board, pipelines, gas wells, all the infrastructure?
I mean, there are several groups that are working on that. I wouldn't think there's one individual group who's really the lead, but there are several. Some that focus on really how to mitigate emissions across the oil and gas supply chain. Several of the oil and gas trade associations also work on issues like that, including American Petroleum Institute. There are international groups like the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative that help really look at technologies both to quantify emissions and to mitigate emissions. Some of those are focused more on upstream, but there are a lot that do look system-wide.
Do we have any more questions from reporters in the room? Is that it?
Hi, Ms. Nowlan. How do you encourage companies and these other entities to embrace the sort of regulation that you're talking about, other than either showing them that it saves them money, either by, in operations or in terms of, avoiding punishment?
Well, you hit on a few of the planks that we talk about with companies. One of the advantages in the methane space is that you start with the point of it's a waste of money, right? Methane is natural gas, and that's a saleable product. So we often start with that, and that's the beginning of the conversation. Then there's the point of the social license to operate, especially in areas such as Colorado, where Oil and gas facilities are right up against schools and homes. Folks are concerned about leaks. There's the impending regulation is another thing that they're curious about. That their investors are curious about as well. Investors are very much pressuring oil and gas companies, and we work with those investors to at least know what they're leaking, and then to take steps to mitigate that waste. Then, as we've had success with a couple of forward-thinking companies taking those steps to deploy new technologies, they've actually learned even more about why it's useful to understand and mitigate methane emissions. So, for example, one thing that folks care about is minimizing what they call windshield time, which is how the leak detection crews are basically driving around all the time with the cameras and often not finding things. And that's actually one of the most dangerous parts of their job. They have a lot of road accidents. And so we talk about, could you have new methodologies that reduce the time your crews are driving around not finding leaks? And they never thought about it that way, but that's actually quite an important factor for them. And then secondly, the operators that have deployed, say, new continuous monitors, they're talking about waste, they're talking about safety, but then they're also realizing that it enables them to understand what's going on in the well site in a new and powerful way, and they're realizing these leaks perhaps are happening because processes are happening on the well site which are not our approved practice. People are, who knows what, and they're learning more about what's happening on their own facilities, and then they're able to take steps to improve. So from the beginning, it starts from waste, from safety, and then they actually realize that they like it, and they are learning what's going on in their own facilities in a new way.
Eileen, doesn't the state of California have regulations now to quantify whole supply chain methane emissions for natural gas? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, sorry. I was like, where is the question coming from? I was like staring out in the sun.
Sorry, I threw you off.
No. So California, I'm not an expert on California, so I don't want to misstate, but they do have, arising from the Aliso Canyon incident, they've put forward a whole suite of regulations around continuous monitoring, around quantification, and around trying to encourage operators both to report and to deploy new technologies. So, yeah, definitely more to come from there.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have other questions from reporters in the room?
Just building off of what you were just saying, I'm curious if, well, I guess I have two questions. One, among those arguments you make to engage, industry players, which do you find have the most traction or most compelling? So if you had to rank, you'll save money, you'll preserve your social license to operate, safety of your own employees. What is the hierarchy of concern among the firms that you work with? And then my second question has to do with what do you see as some of the regulatory obstacles to getting these new technologies, like these laser-based continuous monitoring systems, in use out in the field? So, for a small firm that wants to provide that service, what hurdles do they need to clear to actually have a viable business, say in Colorado, let's just say, for the sake of...
Mm-hmm. So those are two very good questions. I'm not sure I can quantify, 1, 2, and 3 in terms of what's persuasive. It changes. When oil was $100 a barrel, the waste, question was maybe, even though it's different kinds of leaks, obviously. So it changes over the course of the months. Now, one thing to think about in terms of what's persuasive is many of the international oil majors have made commitments to a Paris Agreement future. So now at this point, we are not even in a position of trying to invent or trying to persuade them a new step to take. Now what's important is to hold them accountable to the commitments that they've already made and to say this is absolutely not just cost effective and easy to implement, but it is consistent with what you have said is essential for your business in the long term. So that's really important right now. And that's basically the number one point to remember right now. In terms of regulatory obstacles, let's say your picture being one of the 26,000, people in this building and saying, man, I'm hearing all this about methane. I have an idea. I really want to build a business. I want to get it out there. What do you face, right, in order to make that real? And what we've heard is the lack of regulatory clarity is the number one obstacle for someone devoting years of time, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. I don't know how much it costs to run VTech. It's not small. And then if I were to say, Dan, release a ton of methane for me, the steps to prove yourself are quite expensive and time consuming. So what justifies someone taking those steps to become a methane innovator? You have to have really specific guidelines from the regulator to say, if you achieve these metrics, you are at least approvable, right? You can't guarantee that it'll be approved, but here are the metrics so that an engineer knows what to aim for, knows what to ask Dan to test for example, right? And then you need a process with the regulator where you know who to talk to, you know what to give them when you come to that point of starting to ask for approval. Then you need to understand the market. So maybe it takes a year to get approved in Colorado. You can't then have a year to do Colorado, another year for Pennsylvania, another year for Alberta, another year for California, right? That's just far too long. You can't do 1 year for each well site, right? So you need to know, once I get approved under conditions where I have justified myself to work in this methodology, then there's a market where lots of folks can adopt that methodology under the conditions that it's been proven to be effective. So the exciting thing about this is there's been just astonishing agreement between regulators, environmentalists, operators, innovators on this point of how to create regulations that encourage innovation. I think people are really hungry for this, for seizing and encouraging the real influx of innovation we've seen in this space. And also regulators are thinking about it as, what can the sort of sensor revolution do to help me do my job better, right? How can I use just the ability to understand the world far faster and cheaper to do my work as a regulator, to be in constant conversation with industry and environmentalists, use the benefit of the technology to do my job better rather than this sort of 5-year, very heavy, high-touch, gold-plated regulatory process, which has, been, for good reason, the status quo.
So we're working on what we call a path to equivalency, because if you look at the way the regulations are written in the U.S. today, to some extent the way they're operating in Canada as well, what you're saying is that you need to have a solution which is as good or better than the current regulatory approved method. And so the idea behind a path to equivalency, what kind of testing will you do, how would you demonstrate that testing, and how would you make that approvable across a wide range of regulatory entities, I think is the question right now. So for my VTech group, we started out by just testing technologies, but we're changing our focus now is to try to facilitate that process, how you actually package things for regulatory approval.
Do we have other questions from reporters in the room? I think that's it. Okay, we can kind of end there, but keep it kind of open and informal, and the panelists can hang around for a few minutes if people want to ask some questions individually, but we'll just formally end there. Thanks all for coming.